Today's courageous conversation is sure to be a hot topic. Sexuality. What does the Bible say about sexuality? And we have 4 Old Testament scholars to help us to navigate this question. The first is Dr. Rodney Sadler. He is the professor of Bible at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. The second one is Dr. Gafney. She is the professor of Hebrew Bible at the Bright Divinity School in Texas. The third one is Dr. Cleotha Robertson, who is the professor of Old Testament at the Nyack College in New York. And the fourth is Quonekuia, who is instructor for Old Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Boston.
Well, enjoy the show.
Raphael Warnock offers this thesis that the black church has a divided mind, and there probably may not be a more divided or divisive subject than the one about sexuality. So the first question I want to ask each of you is, first of all, how do you define sexuality and what informs that definition? We'll start here.
In this climate, just a definition of sexuality is a messy issue. How I define it, based on my own training, is I go back to a biblical text. That's my guide for me. That's my training. You know, I could bring another definition to the text, but then that would not be a Christocentric or text-centric definition. So for me, I start at Genesis 1 and 2, which I think informs all of the Old Testament, and I think it also informs the New Testament as well. So for me, when I'm grappling with issues of sexuality, for me, that's where I go back. I go back and see how the text informs my thinking about sexuality. Also acknowledging, as an African-American male, urban, raised in a Black Baptist church, I'm going to bring my presuppositions to that. And all of us, when we're looking at the text, bring our presuppositions to the text. But my genesis of trying to define sexuality has to be Genesis 1 and 2, but then I also have to acknowledge that because of Genesis 3, we live in a fallen world that tries to redefine that.
I think I would look at sexuality. I definitely would start at Genesis 1 and 2, but I also would go straight to the heart of the matter. I look at it as our impulses, our desires, how it frames how we think about ourselves as sexual beings, how it frames how we talk about ourselves, how we sort of interact with others, and how that is expressed with other people, whether you identify with a particular gender or not, but how that is being expressed. I think I sort of look at all of that as sort of guiding sexuality.
Boy, thank you for the easy question. I think in terms of sexuality, I would begin again, perhaps in Genesis 2, the latter part of that, where the man leaves his father, mother, cleaves to his wife, the two become one flesh, as an introduction to a notion of sexuality as a return to wholeness, attempt to get back to the full Adam that was created at the beginning, this bifurcated being coming back together again. That would be my interpretation of the origins there. But if I were to think about sexuality, I'd say it's related to sex. Sex is a wonderful opportunity for us to experience the fullness of life. Life at its fullness. The orgasmic experience is the fullness of life, if anybody's ever had sex. But in addition to that experience, though, I'd say that sex also is the way that life reproduces itself. So sex is tied to life. It's a necessary component in that. But also, in terms of sexuality, I'd say that you can't talk about sexuality without talking about power. Because how we define sexuality often determines who is and who is not empowered in society. And if I can Let me just say this, I always say this, you can't have power defined in ways that give advantage to some without taking away power from others. So as we think about the creation of sexuality, we have to think about the way that we align power in larger society.
So when Dr. Rhodes asked about how we define sexuality, I want to note that the original question did not put the biblical text on the table. Some of our colleagues start there. So I want to remind us of the question I heard, because my first response when you asked it before I heard my colleagues is that I understand sexuality to be the processes by which a human person lives fully in their body, that it is physical, it is emotional, it is spiritual, and the ways in which they relate intimately with another person. And because I'm a biologist, I think of the physicality of that, and for that reason, do not turn first to the biblical text. We've had a lot of theology here. For me, God is larger than the Bible, and what I understand God to know is more than the persons who recorded the Bible. The persons who recorded the Bible did not know, for example, that there was such a thing as an ova. They believed in a homunculus. That is, they believed that every human person was contained in sperm. So when I'm looking for to talk about sexuality biologically, Genesis is not going to be a source text for me, though it may be talking about it emotionally and spiritually.
Thank you. And let's flag the biological piece for a later part of this conversation. But for Dr. Gafney and Dr. Day, both of you are Hebrew, Bible, Old Testament scholars. And so all four of you. Well,
I'm sorry, New Testament faculty.
We love you.
The
we'll
real
start
Bible,
with the
the
two
real
of you,
Bible.
and then work our way around. You did bring up Genesis 1 and 2, also 3, complicating what happens in the creation narrative. Talk to us about whether or not there's a unitary biblical doctrine of sexuality, or is it much more complicated based on your understanding both of the original language and how the text has been received throughout the centuries.
Seems like there's an elephant in the room and nobody wants to touch it.
No, well, listen, say I can. I just spoke, so I
would argue this. I would argue based on the paradigm of Genesis 1 and 2, we're looking at a monogamous heterosexual relationship. And when I'm, as a pastor, dealing with the stuff that I have to deal with, most of us come to the text and to the gospel, I say, post Genesis chapter 3. And so then I bring my isms, my stuff that life has put on me, the abuses, the difficulty, and then I try to grapple with that in view of looking at Genesis 1 and 2. That, at least from an exegetical point of view, that we're looking at something that's monogamous. We are looking at something that's heterosexual. We are looking at something that's wholesome. If we're exegeting the text, but realizing as well, in a pluralistic society, people are going to define that differently. I'm a big boy, I understand that. But if we're going to be honest to the text and grapple with that, I think that that's what the text says.
So I think that we go to heterosexuality too fast. That's my opinion as someone that's in the church and as an ordained minister, and I see so many different things. I think that we're uncomfortable talking about sexuality independent of being in a relationship with someone. So if I'm a single woman and I feel very, very confident and very sexual, very, just sexy in myself, just that bothers. That's a bothersome conversation. And so I think that we moved, a little too fast to heterosexuality. Not that I'm confused on where I stand with that at all, but I think there needs to be more dialogue about how we are sort of experiencing our own bodies, because you can't really talk about heterosexuality, homosexuality, any of those things, if we just can't have dialogue first about, I don't know, Sarah, when she finds out that she's going to have a child again, well, she's going to have a child first, right? So she is enthused by this idea of having a desire. Now, we don't talk about the desire. We talk about, oh, she's going to have a baby, but she's thinking about the joy of sex. That's like a big thing.
She's thinking about the wetness. That's the word.
You see, okay, you see, but we don't talk about that. We talk about the promised seed, and I think we sort of skip some of these pieces. And these are important discussion points if we want to help our churches move forward. We need to be comfortable or get to a place where we're comfortable talking about that Sarah is looking forward to being intimate with her husband.
So I understand that as our facilitator, you put biology later, but I am going to put it back on simply because we cannot discuss sexuality apart from the human body, which is a biological organism. And sexuality is related to gender. Gender is complex, both the physiological features and what I'm going to call socio-psychological features, right? The biblical text, as Brother Cleotha is my friend, so I'm calling him by his name because I know his first name more than I know his last name. Cleotha is speaking on this very first unit of Genesis, and absolutely that's how it's presented. But for me, that's a question of genre. What function is that serving in the literature? It's an ideological story. It's telling the story of the people, the ancestors, the larger family story. That story necessarily reflects the dominant culture, which was a heterosexist, heteronormative culture. That story doesn't account for all people. It doesn't account for intersex people, right? So the story is shaped in a particular way. When we talk about how Genesis frames sexuality, you're absolutely right. Once you get beyond 2 and maybe 3, things start to look different because then you get polygamy on the stage. Mm-hmm. So what happens with polygamy is human beings configure marriage in a social construct. But what is interesting to me about that is while there'll be discourse about that in the New Testament, that God never says, what I created was this Eve-Adam pairing, and that's supposed to be normative for you all. In fact, God participates in polygamy, according to some texts, by rewarding patriarchs with wives and women. So at one level, that suggests that human beings can configure marriage. But on the other hand, when God says, here is how I want you to live before me, and God gives statutes from the 10 Commandments to the entirety of the Torah, God never rebukes or reforms that practice. And I think that's something we have to contend with. And in fact, those of you who do New Testament and church history know that polygamy wasn't overruled really until the Romans said enough is enough, because the church fathers were split, the rabbis were split, right?
I would argue that it is critiqued because we look at the dysfunction of all of the patriarchal families. And so as a part of our free will, the Lord, with many of the choices we've made, doesn't come down and say, don't go to the Sugar Shack Club, or don't grab that.
Yeah.
Let me finish.
I didn't say it wasn't critiqued. Be clear. I did not say it was not critiqued. I said it was not.
But I'm arguing that what we see in the patriarchal narratives, particularly when you go from 12 on to 50, we see families dysfunctional. We see children trying to kill one another, and then out of that dysfunction, God still brings his purpose. And so I would argue that it is critique because we see the negative decisions that they make, and we see it play out on their lives. And we see a God who allows it, but then by his providence, you meant it for evil, but God means it for good, that he does bring a providential spin to it. So that I would argue that it's allowed, but I would not say then that that's a checkpoint that God gives those kinds of relationships.
I would just say this before we go further. I think that we have to recognize the multivalent nature of the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible in particular. It's not speaking with one voice, and that's the thing I'd want to push back against. It's not speaking with one voice. It's not setting up one ideal. And in as much as it does, it presents sex, sexuality, and marriage in different lights. And in part, I think that that's empowering, because in our own contemporary context, it can enable us to imagine that God can use different things. I mean, you've got stories that talk about women utilizing their sexual power in order to perpetuate the lineage that are valorized. Stories like Tamar, the stories like Ruth, where sexuality is used quite overtly in the midst of the text in a way that would seem to run against our, dare I say, contemporary Christian Protestant paradigms. So I think the Bible is much more complex. If I can make this one term part of this conversation today, I think we need to complexify our reading of the narrative instead of moving to imagine that it sort of says one thing or speaks with one voice.
Yeah.
Now, Rodney and I are friends, so we push back on this at conferences. I would argue that I think that there is a unified kind of construct of what marriage is. That I would argue that 1, 2, and 3 are held up as a prism through which we look at marriage, both in the Old and New Testament. That kind of sex outside of that sense of monogamy is held up negatively. Even the covenant is a metaphor for God's relationship with Israel. We see it in the book of Hosea. We see it mentioned in the book of Malachi, where there is a sense of monogamy and a sense of, if you will, exclusivity, whereby that's the paradigm. And Israel, over and over again in the prophetic books, are challenged because they violate that sense of monogamous fidelity to Yahweh. So I would argue that we have it there, and that it's even put on a larger collective sense in God's relationship to Israel. And we see it all throughout the prophets.
Let me interject quickly
I
about...
would really love to respond to that.
Oh, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
So you are absolutely correct about marriage as a metaphor framing the relationship of God and Israel and the rage that ensues. In fact, God often functions as a battering husband in response to Israel's infidelities, bringing on the enemies to beat, and sometimes sexualized language is used, as Dr. Weems has spelled out for us so clearly, in battered love. God does not tolerate others. I think we could all agree that that's the posture of the marital fidelity. But in the Israelite system, a married man could and did have sex with slaves, could and did have sex with prostitutes, could and did have sex with women who were neither under the control of a father who would be offended or married to someone else. So what sexuality looked like, what marriage looked like, and when we talk about God's participation, you have God and Moses telling the Israelites, when you go to battle and you see a woman among the enemy who you find attractive, you may take her for yourself, shave her head and cut her nails before you go into her. So you have the narrative saying that God is calling for abduction, rape marriages. You have Moses saying in the Exodus journey, on the way to freedom, so we can imagine the people have left Egypt, they haven't gotten to the promised land. When a father sells his daughter into slavery, she shall not go free as a male shall. So sexuality is being constructed in the Bible in particular ways that simply that are not being critiqued in the text. These are being presented as normative. Slave rape and impregnation is nation building. So while those early chapters of Genesis represent some ideals and the world is not in that place, there's not the sense in my reading that these things are not normative, and so the biblical text is sustaining those practices and sometimes attributing them to God.
Can I just interject? That is a realized tension within the text, understandably. But I think we also need to, if we look at that, we also need to take account of the moments when God shows up in the text sort of unexpectedly and sort of gives a law concerning the concubine. In Exodus 21, it says, okay, if she's not getting her conjugal rights and if she's not being cared for, then she is free to go. And that is an amazing moment that she can leave this man and he has no claim to her. That is just radical, right? And then you look at Tamar's situation and you look at Bathsheba's situation. Those situations, God was very upset. You have the moment where it says that, God was angry or God is bothered. So yes, we do see these moments in the text where you're like, well, what is going on here in Israel? But then you see these bursts of moments where women are serving at the tent of the meeting, and all sort of moments where God is sort of standing up with a great voice that this is happening, but this does not please me.
Exactly. Rodney's multivalent. All of that's there.
So how then, for hermeneutical purposes, how do we work through, if there are these different conflicting or texts that seem to conflict but are harmonious at the end, if I am, to borrow from Dr. Edmondson's statement on an earlier panel, in Sunday school, in my devotional time, just reading all of these texts, how do I bring them all together to make sense of what God wants for me in my life as a response to reading what has been declared in the Word? I mean, I kind of hear two different hermeneutical approaches. One is, ultimately, Genesis 1 and 2 will frame the ultimate arc of the Scripture. Over here I'm hearing, well, it's too messy and complicated, and so there's not really a one-size-fits-all. I'm in the pew, I'm confused. What do I need to do with this text that both sides agree, is difficult to read at first glance?
I think one of the things we have to do is teach people, whether you believe that there are multiple authors or whether you believe it's an authorial tent, historical grammatical method, is to hear what the text is saying. So you look at the characters, recognize what voices are you hearing from those characters. And I think, especially in the Judges 19 passage, we hear a lot by what is not spoken by the concubine. So I think that the way that we sort of teach or instruct people is to, at least for me, I believe in the scriptural authority. I also would encourage people to look a little wider and not be constrained and be open to hearing dialogue that's not necessarily being preached, but to really look at the text and see what else is going on.
If I were looking at the text, one of the things I'd say is that hopefully Sunday school classes will not just be us teaching at people, but hopefully Sunday school's classes will be us empowering the hands of the people to appropriate the text themselves. Hopefully we'll begin to work not just to tell people what the text says, but to give them the tools to be able to wrestle with the difficult things themselves. And one of the things that might be difficult to do is to say, you've got to begin to make choices as you read as to what voice you're going to lift up from this text. Which paradigm seems to stand out? Why do you think God wrestles with marriage in this way and comes down on this side in this text? So one of the things I hope that we'll be able to do is move beyond the traditional notion of Sunday school as us as conveyors of knowledge, the class as those receiving it, and become those who help to empower people to read and make determinations for themselves. And then we can work together as community to try to find a voice that resonates with what we hear God speaking.
So yes, I hear that. I think that's a great point. On the other side of that, you've got, say, some of the things you're saying. If you're saying that across the pulpit or in the Sunday school class, and Big Mama's been in Bible study, Sunday school class for 30 years, what she's hearing something very radical, very new, that she may think is your attempt to shake her faith. You brought up the wetness part earlier about Sarah. I mean, that's also a translation language issue, because most of us don't have translations with, Sarah was excited to be wed again. At least I don't know those texts. So even that, there may not be so much an issue of top-down learning, but without the benefit of the nuances of the languages, we're missing the sexuality in certain texts because the language doesn't afford it. The translation doesn't afford it. So how do we do that if we're not Hebrew or Greek scholars? How do we get access to that if we've not been to seminary?
Well, there are all kinds of tools out there, and for some of us, our work is making that accessible. That's what my most recent book, Womanist Midrash, does, is it works through issues of translation in an accessible language and helps people negotiate some of these texts.
Wow. So how can someone, if they want to get involved with Jude 3 and support this amazing event that you have and just everything that Jude 3 does, how can they get involved?
Well, one of the major ways they can get involved is to donate. The Jude 3 Project not only impacts churches, but we also have an HBCU tour where we engage students on campuses around the topic of Christianity being the white man's religion, and we combat that false narrative.
Yeah.
And one of the things we do is we raise support to help fund the HBCU tour so that the schools won't have to pay for that. So one of the ways that people can support us in reaching students is to give at jude3project.com, or they can mail in their gift, and there's an address at jude3project.com to mail in your gift if you want to do it that way as well.
Awesome, awesome. So
I think the first thing that we have to do is begin to say, this is something that's part of what we need to do, and begin to open up the space where we can have these conversations. So it's not just two different opinions. It's the ability to even say that this is something that Jesus might want us to talk about, that Jesus would be all right if we talked about, that Jesus says we need to talk about. So.
Can I jump in here? Just to that point, I think that, especially with the tension with the homosexual brother or sister who feels rejected or isolated, I think their concern is that they want the church to engage with this conversation. And I would always, my thought is that the church is having its own problem talking about sexuality. And so I wonder if it's even the question. I think sometimes the society is moving a little faster than the church, and we can't even talk about sexuality, let alone homosexuality. So first of all, if we can just do that piece and be honest, we can talk about, okay, that a lot of people have a lot of desires that are crossing a lot of boundaries. We watch all these TV shows that have all these homosexual images, and we talk about how much we love those shows from the pulpit, but then we denounce those very people who come to our church. And so I think that we need to really be honest with ourselves and say that, okay, I'm speaking from a very conservative viewpoint, that we're not where we need to be to sometimes engage with very difficult conversations. And I think that when we get to language, there's some other pieces that can be talked about as well.
Yeah, I concur. I think the broader subject of sexuality is something that we need to deal with more honestly in the church, right? Not just about homosexuality, but all kinds of sexual desire. I think going back to the piece about Raphael Warnock, the divided mind of the black church, for instance, around the issues of marriage, for instance, there are very clear camps. And unfortunately, those camps aren't doing what we're doing in this conversation. Having dialogue, disagreement, but without dehumanizing the other group for their stance, whether it's pro-traditional marriage or the belief that there are multiple forms of marriage, et cetera. So I'm thinking, for instance, back in my hometown of Jackson, Mississippi, when these conversations come up, you're right. Sometimes when you finally get the divergent groups in the room together, there are the crickets. But you can't even get them in the room because they've automatically tweeted enough about each other, about how evil that other group is, that I can't really see you in person. I've subtweeted about you so bad, about how you are the spawn of Satan, or you're Donald Trump #2, or whatever the issues are from other sides. And in the messiness of all of that, it's hard for the church to say, let's come and reason together, especially when, after we've reasoned together, we've got the same languages, the same texts, but we'll still end up at different conclusions on a host of things regarding sexuality. And it seems very difficult to find consensus, or at least the sense, we're going to disagree about this, but we can walk together, or we're going to disagree about this and believe that your way is not only wrong, it is dehumanizing to a population, or it is something that will lead you to damnation. I mean, that seems to be the ultimate import.
And when we're talking about biblical interpretation and translation for that matter, it matters who does it. So when we have a conversation, someone owns the table, right? Someone set up this talk today and invited us to participate. Sometimes when those conversations are had, the very framing of the conversation marginalizes and excludes. So I am going to disagree with my sister here to say that we're going to, let's talk about sexuality. I agree with you that it's absolutely under-discussed in the church. But if we say, let's just talk about sexuality now, because we're not talking about it, but not talk about homosexuality, then what we have done is excised a portion of God's children from the conversation. And so then what sexuality becomes in that discussion, by virtue of being framed that way, is heterosexuality, which is not named. We've just said, we're just going to do sexuality, plain sexuality, regular sexuality, normal sexuality, our sexuality. We will deal with them later. And so a lot of what we do is marginalizing. And so if we have everybody and every kind of body at the table, then the questions are not just, how do we read this text? How do we understand this text? But what are the sources of our theology? And we need to have some people at the table in the room saying, I am a gay man and I am created in the image of God.
Amen.
Right? My body and my sexuality matter. They're valid. They're precious in the sight of God. But if a group of people who are heterosexual or are performing heterosexuality for various and sundry reasons, don't have those voices at the table, then we're not doing the work that needs to be done. We're reinscribing a power hierarchy and removing people from the table.
So I absolutely agree with that. I guess I'm still stuck at what is ultimately an impasse. You can, let's hypothetically say you have a wide circle with multiple persons represented, engaging all the various valences that come with that, and we still leave. For instance, we may, after this great conversation we've had that I think Lisa's done a great job putting together, people will still leave with the same mind about the subject that they came in with.
And that's okay.
It is okay, but I guess there's also the issue of, it's not a kind of, oh, it's okay that we disagree. At the end of the day, there's a fissure in God's family where there's not only disagreement, but ad hominem to both sides. There's, I can't stand you, or all of that stuff is there. And I think we can't run away from that element of how the dialogue breaks down.
Could I make a couple points on that one? Perhaps after this conversation, what we will say is that, I love these brothers and sisters that have a different opinion. I may not agree with them, but I understand them a bit better. So maybe there's a new space that's created in that regard. Maybe this kind of conversation opens up the doors for potential change later on. And I don't want, in some of these conversations, I don't want us to move towards a middle. I think a middle might be a bad place. But maybe there's more space for us to continue this dialogue. So first thing I want to say on that. The second thing I want to say is really just more a statement as we talk about things like homosexuality. I think we need to begin to wonder why it is that we talk about concerns like homosexuality the way that we do as the church, or we refuse to do it. So for example, if I look at the Bible, there are a few passages that we talk about in relationship to homosexuality. Genesis 19 is one. It's usually the dominant one. It defines the quote-unquote sin, sodomy, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the passage carefully. I will make an argument. It really isn't talking about homosexuality, and it's not really even talking about hospitality. It's talking about the way that you treat the poor, the disadvantaged, in a very significant way, in a way that if we looked at it critically, might say there's something wrong with American society where we have incredibly wealthy people who refuse to do anything for those who are impoverished. It might critique us. So we find a way to interpret that text that looks at somebody else and calls them out for their quote-unquote sin. We look at passages like Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, that wrestle with the notion of lying with a man as with a woman is problematic. And we don't tend to realize that this is in the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is a book that's written by a group of priests that were trying to define who was in and who was out of the faith, who was clean and who was unclean. And we forget the fact that we are the unclean. But we lift up this passage to talk about who else is determined to be unclean in it. And we make this the principal text that we use to talk about their uncleanness without recognizing that this text would have excluded us as well at the beginning. As we go through these texts, we realize that there's probably a whole lot less about homosexuality in the Bible than we spend time talking about. So then we need to ask ourselves, why do we spend so much time worrying about homosexuality? One thing I might say is that homosexuality and abortion, which tend to be the quote-unquote sins of the right, are two things that cisgendered, heterosexual white men can't do. Therefore, they're the worst things that God hates in the world. And if this is true, then maybe we need to problematize what's going on as we look at these things. Maybe we need to think about whose power is being represented by particular interpretations. And maybe we can begin to recognize that perhaps we read certain texts the way we do because it's serving someone else's interests, not our own.
I would just like to sort of interject there. I think one of the issues that comes up with why we spend so much, well, first, we don't have a lot of passages on homosexuality, but I don't think that's cause to dismiss it as what Scripture says. I would think on why we spend so much time on it in church, I think that we have misinterpreted the spirit of the text. It's not just, if I'm speaking, I have a lot of homosexual friends, people who are in church, and people I know, some who are struggling with this, some who have decided that this is their path. I think the issue is a lot of times with church, when people come into church and they see them, whether they're transgender or whether they're cross-dressing, whatever, they make it the focus. And I remember just a short story. I remember my dad passed. My dad's Muslim. I remember he told me before he passed to not bury him as a Muslim, but not bury him as a Christian, but bury him as a Muslim. So we did. But he allowed us to have a Christian memorial service, and I preached that. And there was a Muslim that came to me and said she was excited about the word, because it was the first time she could be in church, and she heard the word, and we didn't make it about her. And I think what happens in a church, we make it about the homosexual rather than the redeeming work of Christ. And so I think in some ways we have missed the whole point of Christ, which is to preach Christ crucified to all people and not to send everybody to hell because, of their path.
Speaking about redemption in Christ, one of the other sort of, I think, elements in the room with regard to sexuality is the predatory nature of sexuality in our churches sometimes, and that we don't talk a lot about sexuality in general. We also don't talk about assault and incest and all numbers of things. And so, before we prepare to wrap up, I wanted to talk about that, and also how we deal with the issue of modesty and who's at fault in these moments. We often talk about the scantily clad woman and not the check on why the man is lusting and not resisting urges or whatnot. So I wanted to talk about that and how that relates to the broader conversation about biblical hermeneutics, theology, and what should the church be doing to address the issues of sexual abuse broadly defined.
So for me, this is an example of why it matters that you have not just women, but womanist and feminist women in pulpits and in teaching spaces. You framed your introduction as we don't, but we do. Some of us preach about rape and incest. When I tell the Sarah and Abraham story, I name their union as incestuous, right? Talk about David's rape of Bathsheba. She did not commit adultery. She was sinned against. When God started handing out punishments, God had no punishment for her because she had not transgressed, right? So some of us name those things, and we need to continue to do those things. I am not from the portion of the Black church that was heavily invested in modesty culture. So for me, I actually take this parable of Jesus when he says, or this teaching of Jesus, if your eye offends you, pluck it out, to be placing the onus on the person who is doing the looking. I'm not saying y'all should snatch your eyes out. What I am saying is that doesn't mean go put a modesty cloth on her. I think our Muslim brothers have this. custody of the eyes. If you can't handle what you're seeing, lower your eyes. That's the same principle. That's where the onus is. But your greater point that people who are in pews are not hearing sermons about rape and incest and are not, let alone in the structures of the church, creating systems of accountability to deal with predatory members, that is absolutely correct in many cases.
Anyone else?
You can give me my claps, it's all right.
I think one of the things I've tried to do as a pastor is to make sure that I have some of my female pastor friends or my students come to preach, because they would bring a different slant on a text than I would as a man. For a long time at the church, I was single. And so it could be a rough thing to be in a church of color as a single man. Mm-hmm. And so I would challenge my members. I say, look, there's single guys here, there's single women here. I can't institute a dress code. However, there has to be some sense of modesty. When we have dress down in the summer, I don't expect the men to come in with body shirts on. And then everybody started laughing, ah, ha, ha, ha. And then I said, I don't expect my sisters to have spandex on. Because I can tell you, a lot of times I'm up there as pastor, and sisters visiting would have shirts on, dresses on their thigh. And so I'm trying to preach like this, or preach with my eyes closed. But the challenge is that we are sexual, and that there is that is a reality. But then as well, to challenge seasoned saints with some sense of modesty and respect for the place. I grew up in a traditional Black Baptist church, Cornerstone Baptist Church in Bed-Stuy, and with the hats and the dresses, and there was a certain kind of dress. Now in this millennial generation, there just isn't that. But if somebody comes in the church, I can't make that an issue. But as well, there has to be some kind of sense of respect and decorum for the place. And so it's a kind of slippery slope that you have to tread with that if you're in the church in a practical way.
I would just add, concerning what's going on with so much sexual abuse and all those sorts of matters, I think we should really preach the text, right? The Ham commits incest. That's my interpretation when seeing his father's nakedness. So I think that we really need to sort of talk about the very difficult things to talk about. And I think if we talk about those things, then we have a safe place to deal with them, and we can show people how they need to interrelate with one another. To act like these things are not happening is just a farce. It should not be that you come to church and that you're molested or raped by a leader or a minister or your Sunday school teacher. It should be the safest place that you're at. And so I think we need to have more preaching on those things, but we simply are, we don't do too much of it.
Preaching, but also making sure that you may be partnered with some of the kind of healthcare professionals who can deal with that stuff. Because many of us as pastors, we don't have the kind of clinical training to deal with some of the hard issues that come across our desk. When I first got to the church, I was there late one Wednesday night, and so a couple walks in. And it was a couple that was going through a divorce. The woman walks in, and I could immediately on her wrist see that there's scar tissue. So she walks in, and I said, oh, Lord, she's tried to commit suicide. So here I am, a new pastor there, and I'm dealing with a couple that are dealing with divorce and suicide. The man was having a menopausal issue and wanted to get some young gal and put away his wife of 20 years. And so they come, and they want me to fix it in 15 minutes. And I said, let me be totally honest with you. This is beyond my pay grade, and there's no way I can quote Romans 10:9 and John 3:16 to deal with this. I'm going to meet with you a couple of times, and then I'm going to refer you. And so I work with a lot of social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and I'm always in the business of referring, because I just can't sit down. I don't have the patience to listen to somebody's problem for 2 and 3 hours. I want to throw a Bible at somebody.
Yeah.
And so I'm in the process of referring them, knowing
Amen.
that when somebody walks in, it's beyond me. But knowing if that's a need, I got to get them some kind of help. And they'll come to me because they trust me. But then it's then my challenge then to walk them to the kind of person that they will trust. And I've done that a bevy of times.
So let me, this on the same basic theme. I think the text, even when it is most sexually whatever, often has a sense of modesty. So Song of Song, most of us would probably agree, is perhaps the most sexual book in the Bible. Amen. Climbing people's grape clusters and squeezing different type of fruit. But one of the things that's sort of interesting about it, I was just looking at chapter 2, verse 7, and this is the NRSV translation. Daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the wild does, do not stir up or waken love until it's ready. There's a sense of discipline that seems to be found in a lot of these texts. And I think that we can lift up themes like that to say that even though we may not agree what sexuality is or should be, we might find that there are consistent notions about whatever it is, because of love, because of other reasons, we should try to find ways to discipline the way that we engage. Sorry to say this, because I think I'm put on the quote-unquote progressive side of this conversation, but I'm actually pretty sexually conservative. Actually, because I'm sexually conservative, that's the reason why, I know everybody's going to hate me now when I say this, that's the reason why I've been able to be one who does not oppose gay marriage. In essence, if the rule about monogamy, it makes sense for a man and a woman, then shouldn't it also make sense for gay men or gay women? Shouldn't people have the opportunity to engage in that kind of disciplined relationship as well? If we are lifting up a Christian paradigm, then maybe that Christian paradigm might have a different way of working as well. So I know I've alienated everybody in the room. Forgive me for that.
Go ahead. And Rodney and I have been friends over a decade, and so has Dr. Chi. And I think hopefully what we at least can model in this is the fact that we could disagree vehemently and still go have a cup of coffee afterwards. And so I'm hoping that, because I think this issue has ripped open other communities. And for communities of color, there are just too many issues that we have to address that, as opposed to then mirror those communities and make this kind of a litmus test of whether we should work together. We can work together. We can work together and disagree on that. We can work on housing and disagree on this. We can work on reparations and disagree on this issue. And then we can have colloquiums like this and come back and have good conversation and talk about it again, to at least model the spirit of Christ that has drawn us both to the text.
Yeah. So I want to go back to what we can do in our churches. In Black churches, it is very common that as we meet and welcome new members and get to know them, do you have children? Would you like to work in the Sunday school? What we do not do is fingerprint and background check. And predatory people know that about the Black church, right? They know that there are background checks in the Boy Scouts and in Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right? They know that child workers, everybody in the Episcopal Church has to go through this training regularly. Like they migrate. And when I was in the AME Zion Church, that was raised by our bishops in some spaces, that there were people moving preferentially into Black church and the kind of sometimes other nationality evangelical churches that had sort of open door into the Sunday school policy. So that's something we really need to think about structurally and systemically.
I would say at our church, Church of God denomination, we do background check because we want to provide a safe space. Of course, sometimes the background check takes forever.
Let's thank our panelists for their time and for their engagement with these wonderful
that
questions.
was an amazing topic and an amazing talk on that. So how can someone, if they want to get involved with Jude 3 and support this amazing event that you have and just everything that Jude 3 does, how can they get involved?
Well, one of the major ways they can get involved is to donate. The Jude 3 project not only impacts churches, but we also have an HBCU tour where we engage students on campuses around the topic of Christianity being the white man's religion, and we combat that false narrative.
Yeah.
And one of the things we do is we raise support to help fund the HBCU tour so that the schools won't have to pay for that. So one of the ways that people can support us in reaching students is to give at jude3project.com, or they can mail in their gift, and there's an address at jude3project.com to mail in your gift if you want to do it that way as well.
Awesome, awesome. So until next time, I'm Stan Jr., and I'm here with Lisa Fields. We'll see you next time.